Welcome to the Grand Cathay Army Guide. This is going to come in two parts. This first part looking at the roster and all the units and making sure we understand what they're capable of. And the second part is going to be all about the tactics and strategies of Grand Cathay and how to play them. So, let us begin with... First off, Zhao Ming, the Iron Dragon, one of our legendary lords. He comes in two forms, of course, human and dragon. In the human form, his melee stats aren't anything to write home about. He'll do okay fighting in crowds of low to mid-tier infantry, but with no armor-piercing damage and average weapon strength, he's going to struggle to take on higher-end infantry or characters. The strength of him in this form is in his abilities and magic. He's got Master of Alchemy, which is a damage boost and magical attacks for an area. He's got 3 spells from the Law of Metal, Plague of Rust, Glittering Robe, and Final Transmutation. And then 3 spells from the Yang Law, Dragon's Breath, a nice little breathy, fiery attack. Wall of Wind and Ice, which is a very wide wind attack, good for taking out clumps of infantry. And Constellation of the Dragon and Explosion, which basically just brings down a massive comet. And then there's a few more generic abilities. And then Mastery of the Elemental Winds. This will give a 15% boost to the power of magic for every person on the battlefield that has that trait. We'll talk about that more in part 2 of this. And then we have Metal Shifting and Strength of Yang. These are both triggered when casting. They'll give a damage boost, but you only get one at a time depending on what kind of spell you cast. He also has Arcane Conduit to boost the magic, Warding Iron, which is an area damage resistance ward save of 5%, so that's pretty handy, 5% ward save himself, and then a couple of resistances. He also has a buff to the Battle Harmony of Cathay, which affects all of the army in battle, plus 100% you can see at the top of the unit card, but he does actually lose this when he goes into Dragon form, as well as losing most of his magic. He'll only be able to use one spell when he's in Dragon form. And naturally that spell is Dragon's Breath. If you don't have the Dragon's Breath spell, then you won't get any spells at all, so it is quite important to take that if you do want to use him in Dragon form a lot. But turning into a dragon comes with the perks of being a dragon. He now has more armor, he's much faster, bigger weapon strength with armor-piercing damage, he causes terror. He has an ability as well that when he drops below 25% health, he will gain a 40% damage resistance. And on top of all this, he can fly, and that mobility is generally very powerful, so a strong lord, more of a damage dealer lord I would say, given some of the magic he has, and of course the dragon form. But if you do keep him in human form, he can be a bit more of a support lord with that harmony buff and Plague of Rust and Glittering Robe and things. So that is Zhao Ming. On to his sister then, Ying. Very similar to Zhao in the combat stats, a little more melee attack, a little less melee defense. Same setup on the weapon strength, so not too bad in melee, but nothing special. Does have that harmony amplifier in human form, and of course all of the magics. For those and the abilities, Wrath of the Storm, an area augment to melee attack and psychology, so good for buffing up the troops. And then a mixture of Law of Life and Law of Yin, Earthblood, an area heal, Storm of Shadows, a speed reduction to a single enemy unit, Flesh to Stone, physical resistance for a friendly unit, Missile Mirror, this is the new type of spell that will reflect missiles back at whoever fired them, Regrowth, a big single target heal, and Talons of the Night, a huge vortex for damaging enemies. So mostly defensive kind of spells for helping the army. Got that Mastery of the Elemental Winds as well, as all lords do, so that's just going to buff up the magic. Wounds for the single entities, Disdain of the Dragons. A passive -8 melee attack for all nearby enemy units to her. Then Life Bloom, which is a heal when she casts. Power of Yin, that'll be for when she casts Yin spells. Reduces armor and speed within 55 meters of her, so that's an area spell. Arcane Conduit for buffing up the magic. Missile resistance and spell resistance. And then there's her dragon form. Very similar to Zhao Ming's, she's a little bit more damage dealing though, she's got more melee attack and more charge bonus, but otherwise very much the same deal. Locked to using only Talons of the Night as her spell, losing the Harmony Amplifier but gaining an ability that reduces nearby lord or hero melee defense by 9 while she's in dragon form. So while you might say that Zhao Ming is more of the damage dealer of the two lords, Ying is probably more of the supportive lords with her healing and her supportive abilities by buffing friendly troops and debuffing enemy ones. So those are our two legendary lords for Grand Cathay. Then we have the dragon-blooded Shugengan Lord of Yin. There's also a Yang version. They're both pretty much straight up wizards. They're not completely terrible in melee, but with only 30 armor it's a bit risky. They'll probably want to be on a mount of some kind. They can get a war horse or a great longma, which is a flying horse. They also have an ability, Scales of the Celestial Court, which can help them survive with 75% physical resistance and Strider for 21 seconds. That can help get them out of trouble. And then they've got the Law of Yin, which is a pretty tricksy kind of spellbook. It does have some damage spells, but it's got a hide there, it's got Missile Mirror, it's got that speed reduction, and a summon spell. So you'll be able to summon Ancestral Warriors, which is basically a unit of halberds. So that's really nice and something unique for this Lord. Got Master of the Elemental Winds, Power of Yin, reducing that armor and speed. Also has Will of the Dragons, +4 leadership to an area, so all nearby troops to her will get a bit of a leadership buff on top of what she'll give from Encourage. Arcane Conduit and Jade Amulet, both power increases to magic, so more magic power there, and a bit of a missile resistance too. So if you want a bit of a cheaper Lord and you still want to have that magic ability from the Lord, then these can be a good option. They also have a 50% Harmony Amplifier. You do just have to be a little bit careful with them in melee. And then to our more dedicated melee Lord, although you wouldn't think it looking at his stats. He doesn't have much armor, he's got pretty puny weapon strength, reasonable melee defense, but not going to be fantastic on his own, has the 50% Harmony Amplifier. He can have a horse mount and more uniquely a Sky Lantern, so hot air balloon mount essentially, gaining the extras that will bring, like a ranged attack for example. But this portly lad's selling point is his abilities. He can increase accuracy and reload skill of a ranged unit, charge bonus and melee attack of a melee unit, or melee defense and leadership of anything. He also has the ability to constantly damage nearby flying units with the Kite of the Uttermost Air. That's an area as well, so that's a nice little trick up his sleeve. He also has Will of the Dragons, that was that +4 leadership boost to nearby friendly units, and Shield of Nangao, which gives him more missile block chance and armor the longer he stands still. So that can help make him a little bit tanky alongside the other tanky infantry units. And then he has Tactician, which will give reload skill and melee defense to an area around him. So he's full of tricks, this fella. He can give lots of buffs to all kinds of units. So a nice support lord to the army and the cheapest of the bunch, so you can save some money with a Lord Magistrate. Although he won't bring any magic, so you will have to pay out for a caster. Which brings us neatly to our first hero, the Astromancer, through and through a squishy wizard that is terrible in melee. Low armor, low melee defense, laughable weapon strength. Try to keep them out of melee as much as possible. Maybe they could chase down some missile units or something, but mostly they need to be very, very careful. He is all about the magic with the Law of Heavens at his disposal and all the spells and abilities that come with it. Does have Mastery of the Elemental Winds, so can boost up that magic by 15%. Got a 25% Harmony Amplifier as well, so he can help the army there too. He can get a Warhorse mount as well, which will probably be essential, but more usefully, he can get a Wujing Compass as a mount, which means he'll boost damage even more, just like Mastery of the Elemental Winds. That'll add another 15% on, so he can bring an extra 30% power to magic if you put him on that mount. The other hero option is the Alchemist, which again, squishy wizard, keep them out of melee. Comes with the Law of Metal though, so all of those abilities and spells, Master of the Elemental Winds again. And for some unique abilities, she has a couple of elixirs, one that boosts a single unit's armor by 90 and one a single unit's melee attack by 40. But those are both single-use items. She also has another damage boost ability and can be put on a Warhorse mount. So both of these hero casters could be a good choice to bring along, either of them. If you bring one of the legendary lords and you keep them in dragon form most of the time, you can have one of these two for using up your magic and casting spells, rather than worrying about it from your dragon lord. You may even want to bring both of these heroes in a single army to get the Mastery of the Elemental Winds up and boost your magic if you plan to focus around using said magic. And now with the single characters out of the way, starting at the bottom of the pile then with Peasant Long Spearmen. As a spear unit, they are of course anti-large, which makes them great for defending your flanks from cavalry and monsters. But as a cheap unit with low armor, low leadership and low melee defense, don't expect them to last too long. They do, however, have a charge defense against all and charge reflection, so they pretty much always want to stand still, absorbing those charges. Of course, they can be buffed up with battle harmony. They can get a bit more leadership and melee defense to help them survive better. In campaign, they'll probably be a useful early game unit being so cheap, but otherwise you'll probably be upgrading them to better spearmen soon. And in multiplayer, they're good if you need to bring more numbers of anti-large units. Now to a unit that is a staple of the Cathayan army, Jade Warriors. These will likely be your frontline unit of choice most of the time. They're heavily armored with a bronze shield to protect them from missiles. Their stats don't look like much, but consider the battle harmony on top of that. They'll have way more melee defense and leadership, thus becoming pretty tanky and good for holding the line. They do have defensive stance as well, which means they need to stand still, because when they do, they get more armor and they become more immovable and won't be so easily thrown around when charged into. That's from the charge resistance of defensive stance. They also have formation attack, meaning they try to stay together and fight as a formation all of the time. So this is your prime frontline unit. Just remember not to charge it at enemies, let it stand still and stay beefy. They're also pretty slow on their feet with 28 speed, so staying still makes that not matter as well. And then there's Jade Warrior Halberds, pretty much the same type of deal. They need to stand still to be able to make the most of them. They have a charge reflection, so if any cavalry or monsters or anything charges into them, they're going to take some damage back, so good to keep them stood still. They're an anti-large unit with armor piercing though, so very good for taking out cavalry monsters, lords on mounts and things. So another sturdy tanky unit. They may need to chase things around being an anti-large unit to get after some cavalry and stuff, so they might have to break their playstyle a little bit, but best off keeping them stood still if you can and letting the missiles do the damage. If an enemy army had a lot of large units like the ogres, let's say, then you may want to consider these as a front line, but with no shield they can be a little bit susceptible to being blasted down by missiles. And lastly, for melee infantry, Celestial Dragon Guard. These are the elite spearman unit, anti-large, armor piercing, great for taking down monsters and cavalry, but they are a bit tougher all round. They don't have defensive stance, so standing still isn't as important to them, but still kind of important because they have charge reflection, which means they'll do damage when something charges into them, so good to keep them stood still as much as you can, but if you need to break it and chase after something large, they can be a great deterrent for large units. And that's probably where you'll have these, just 1 or 2 units of these in an army maybe. When something large comes over and starts giving you trouble, you send this unit over and that large unit will probably run away or stupidly stand there and be killed by it, because anti-large is their thing. If you're rolling in money in campaign, then you could have these as a front line and they will be able to do some good work. They'll still be tanky, but they'll have a shield, so a bit of protection from missiles, especially with battle harmony buffs. But now to Cathay's real strength. Kicking off the missile infantry, Peasant Archers. Much like the Peasant Spearmen, they are a low tier unit. Going to be utterly useless in melee, but their range stats aren't too bad. Decent range, okay missile strength and a fair amount of ammunition. They can get a good bit of work done with that for the price that you pay. Going to be a cheap, good early game unit, but you'll probably be quickly replacing them. In multiplayer though, you could bring them in abundance. 3 or 4 units can be pretty good against certain factions, those with less armor perhaps, so good if you bring them in numbers, but a single unit probably not so good by itself. You'll likely be upgrading them to Jade Crossbow Warrior Men. That's not how you say that, Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. These are much better all round. They've got some armor, they've got still pretty crappy melee stats, but their range is better, they have more missile strength, same amount of ammunition, just going to be better all round than the previous unit. With that armor on, they'll be able to take shots from other missile units and trade with them, whereas those peasants will likely just get killed very quickly. And if it should come to the melee, they'll be at least somewhat tough, so they won't be completely terrible. They do have defensive stance, so they will gain a little more armor and melee defense if you stand them still. Plus battle harmony buffs, they can be a fairly tanky missile unit. Not as tanky though as the Jade Warrior Crossbowmen with shields. So they can block a whole bunch of missiles with their bronze shield. That's just going to make them even more tanky than the previous unit. They'll be able to trade with other missile units much better. So like all of these missile units, just good for sitting behind the front line, blasting all the units, the enemy units as they approach, wearing them down before they reach the front line, and just blasting anything that's available. Large units, cavalry moving in, lords and heroes. And if somebody does get a hold of them in melee, they should be able to defend themselves a little bit. They'll have more melee defense than the unshielded version, but a good choice to bring if you're facing a ranged heavy faction. On to Iron Hail Gunners, a unit that's a little bit more specific in its usage. They have a short range at only 90, but very powerful missile strength with 36 and armor piercing. Not too good in the melee though, but where these can shine is as a backline unit kind of protecting the rest of the army. If you have them up front, 90 isn't really a long enough range to be able to do damage to infantry as it approaches. These can be really good if a monster charges into the middle of your army, and you've got 1 or 2 units of these sat back there, they can turn their attention, and because they have a low firing arc, they can fire upwards into the monster without being blocked by any nearby friendly units, and they can do a lot of damage very quickly. So these to me tend to be a good anti-large type of missile unit for shooting monsters and cavalry and anything that's above infantry level. Lords on mounts, they can be great for taking those down quickly, but by all means they can take down infantry if you can get them in a good position to be able to use them with their short range. And then we have Crane Gunners, who are basically the same as Warplock Jezzails from Warhammer 2. They are a long-range missile unit, 275 range, nice armor-piercing damage, missile parry so they can reduce the effectiveness of shields. They have a silver shield themselves so they can take missiles. They're also very spread out so it helps missiles miss if they are being shot at. Although they have way less armor than Jezzails at only 30, so they can't take as much punishment, and they are utterly dire in melee, which they can't really get away from at only 30 speed. At least those rats can get 42 speed and get the hell out of there. Nevertheless though, they are absolutely brutal at what they do. Their long range especially allows them to pressure units way before they get anywhere near reaching you. They can snipe down the strongest units of the enemy army, lords, heroes, flying units, artillery they can even snipe away at. Just a very powerful damage dealer for Cathay. And lastly, the Celestial Dragon Crossbowman. Another more traditional style missile unit, lots of range at 160, armor-piercing missile strength, which is very strong. They've got armor, they've got a shield, they've got some decent melee stats as well, so they can go into melee if they need to, and look after themselves. One of the keys of this unit, much like the Crane Gunners, is to make good use of that armor-piercing ammunition. Don't waste it on crappy infantry, try to save it for the stronger enemy units, strong cavalry, strong monsters, strong infantry, lords. Take those out with this strong ammunition, because likely you won't have many of them in your army because they are pretty damn expensive. And like all missile or yin units, try to keep them near yang units, melee units, so that they can get all the battle harmony buffs from each other. That rides us nicely into the next section. You ever seen a horse with a top knot? Well, now you have. Peasant horsemen are the cheap expendable cavalry for Cathay. Pretty much your typical light melee cavalry. They're very fast with 90 speed and have vanguard deployment so they can be sneaky, which all helps them do their main goal of taking out missile and artillery units. That's really all they're good for. They're not very good at taking on any kind of melee unit. They can maybe cycle charge into the back of some units to try and put leadership penalties on them, but they're not going to do a ton of damage. Their armor and melee defense is simply too low, and they're liable to get shot up easily by missiles, which is why vanguard deployment and the element of surprise is very important for them to really do anything. So good for harassing the enemy backlines of missiles, but not a lot else. You'll be quickly upgrading them to Jade Lancers. These are a much stronger shock cavalry, great for the hammer and anvil, get behind the enemy, hit them in the back. You can still harass missiles and artillery with them too, charge some infantry in the face and pull them out of there. There's lots they can do, and they're pretty tough with 100 armor and a bronze shield. Although they don't have a ton of melee defense, as a shock cavalry, it means that they're supposed to charge in, do damage on their charge, stay there for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and then get the hell out of there and do the same again. If you charge them in and leave them there for like a minute, they're going to take a lot of damage because of their low melee defense. They're one of the few more aggressive units that you can push on the enemy with, because most of the Cathay army is supposed to stay put and play defensive. These can at least put a little bit of pressure on the enemy if you need it. As can the Great Longma Riders. These are flying cavalry, kind of a similar deal to the Jade Lancers, except they're flying. They're a shock cavalry, they hit much harder, still very tough with lots of armor and a bronze shield, which can be very powerfully teamed up with attacked in the rear penalties, because they can flank around and attack units in the back pretty easily. They can potentially break enemy units' leadership pretty damn quickly. So a very powerful unit for Cathay, especially as they don't have that many fast units. These with 105 speed can be pretty damn useful for them. Very versatile and can help pressure the enemy army in a way that most other Cathay units can't. Now, to the assembly of Angry Pots. The Terracotta Sentinel, the big boy for Cathay. They're one big monstrous unit outside of dragons. He's big, tough, and can do a lot of damage, lots of armor. He's unbreakable, so you can't rout him. Doesn't have a ton of melee defense, and being a single large entity, he will get surrounded by infantry, and that can potentially do a lot of damage. He does a lot of damage himself, though, with big weapon strength, armor piercing, just going to be able to put out a lot of damage potentially. But I think the real strength of this boy is being a damage soak, as he has that big armor and lots of health. He can take some punishment, he can absorb all the missiles from the enemy, they'll try to focus fire him down, and that's all drawing fire away from all your other important units that are dealing out damage, your missile units, your artillery, your front line protecting all that. So a useful unit to charge in and be a distraction to help protect the rest of your army while still dishing out a good bit of damage. And that brings us to the final section of the Cathay roster. Cannons, glorious cannons. The Grand Cannon for Cathay is a cannon. Pretty much your typical cannon as we know and love. It's got good missile strength, armor piercing, lots of range at 450, fire on the ammo, which is always nice. And while it's absolutely abysmal in the melee, it does have 30 speed, so it can keep up with the rest of the army. It's not like traditional cannons of the Empire or something, which always end up lagging behind. So these are fantastic for shooting down important enemy units like lords and heroes especially, single entities in general, cavalry as well, monsters, anything larger is generally a better target, but of course it can shoot at infantry as well. It's a big part of Cathay's defensive game plans. And then we have the Fire Rain Rocket, similar to the Empire Hellstorm Rocket Battery. It's got decent range but not the best, nice missile strength though, fire on the ammo. It's generally quite inaccurate, so you don't expect it to land very well, much like a Hellstorm rocket battery, but it does do a lot of damage to infantry, especially if you can land it on them. It's not much use against anything else. The explosive damage is best off landing in the middle of infantry. It won't do too much damage to cavalry and monsters and things like that, so aim this bad boy at infantry, because it can wear them down a lot before they reach your front lines. Again, rubbish in melee, but able to keep up with the army. And then we have the Wujing War Compass. This is a magic chariot, although not really a chariot. You don't want to charge it around like a chariot. Not too good in the melee, low melee defense. Does have a bit of armor so it can survive some missiles, but this thing is all about buffing up the magic. It has Mastery of the Elemental Winds, so it can provide another 15% to your magical power. It has a Harmony Amplifier. It comes with 2 bound spells, Celestial Lightning and Celestial Comet, both bombardment spells. So this is all in all a support unit, good for sticking in the middle of your army, buffing up all the harmony around, giving you the extra magic as well. It can go into melee and do a little bit if it has to, but obviously in the late game is the only time you're going to really want to do that. But if you're bringing a magic focused army, this thing is going to be a good choice to bring along with it. And then to the flying units with the Sky Lantern. This is an aerial missile unit with 360 degree firing and fire whilst moving. Does provide a harmony amplifier as well. Is always flying though, so can't do anything in melee, and once it runs out of ammo it literally is useless. But it has some big range at 275, much like those crane gunners, and has strong missile strength at 90 with armor piercing damage, so it can certainly do a lot of work. Going to be a great one for sniping down strong enemy units, but we'll need to be careful in the sky. If any flying units come after it, you're going to need to keep it near the rest of your army, so other missile units can provide support. Also has an ability that increases spotting range by 100%, so if there's any stalk units trying to sneak up on you, these things will be able to see them before they get anywhere near you. A nice way to get clean shots and constant pressure at important enemy units. This one is kind of like crane gunners in the sky, whereas the Sky Junk flying war machine is more like an artillery in the sky. A mini fire rain rocket perhaps. It's not entirely accurate, but it does a lot of explosive missile strength damage. Also has an artillery-like range at 360, but cannot fire all around. It only fires in one direction, like an artillery. So again, it's kind of like one of the units that already exists, just in the sky, so it has a bit of a clearer shot, and that mobility. Although it is quite slow at 30 speed, and again, needs some serious protection, because it has no defenses in the sky. It can't even fight back in melee, really. But it will want to go on the move a little bit, because it does come with some bombs that can be dropped directly below it. So a lot of potential to do a lot of damage with this thing, provided you can keep it safe. Again, you won't want to stray too far from the army, because you will need the missile protection if there are enemy air units. And it also has that extra spotting distance as well. A nice unit for doing some serious damage to enemy infantry, primarily though because of the style of artillery. And that is the entire Cathay roster. So there we go. That's it for part 1. Hopefully you understand the units now and what their role is supposed to be and what they can do for the army. In part 2, we're going to look at how to use them all together, the tactics and strategies of Cathay, their strengths and weaknesses, and how we can best use them to win our battles. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future.